Hey everyone, and welcome to the show. Have you ever felt like you're getting in your own way? Like you really want something, but something's holding you back. And it's not like an obstacle out there in the world. It's like it's you.
That's such a relatable feeling. That internal struggle is something that so many people grapple with. And it's something that often comes up in memoirs and personal essays. Those stories where people are really honest and vulnerable about their experiences, their struggles, even the funny parts of messing up.
Right. It's that blend of honesty and humor and just the messy reality of trying to figure yourself out. If you're into exploring those themes and you enjoy our deep dives into the human condition, well, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button.
It definitely makes for a fascinating exploration of, well, what it means to be human. All those complexities and contradictions.
Exactly. And the book we're diving into today really tackles that head on. It's called Self-Sabotage by Jeffery Self. And I'll be honest, when I first saw the title, I thought, oh, this is going to be a light and funny read. And there is a lot of humor in it, for sure. But it also goes deeper than that. It's a really honest look at the patterns we create in our lives, the ways we hold ourselves back, even when we desperately want something different. And it's about those moments when we can kind of step outside ourselves and see those patterns for what they are. You can find a link to the book in the show notes, by the way.
What's so interesting about this book, right from the title, is how it frames this idea of self-sabotage. It's not just about external obstacles, it's about those internal forces that can be even more powerful.
Absolutely. And in this deep dive, we're going to be looking at some key moments and themes from the book, using excerpts from Jeffrey's memoir. We'll see how self-sabotage shows up in different parts of his life, from his childhood to his creative pursuits, his relationships, his career aspirations. It's everywhere. So today, we're going to try to understand the different faces of self-sabotage through Jeffrey's experiences, and maybe even see some reflections of those patterns in our own lives. So where do you think we should start?
Well, why don't we begin at the beginning? He shares some really interesting anecdotes from his childhood, and those early experiences can often set the stage for later patterns.
Yeah, he starts with this story about his sister's bike being covered in, well, dog poop
Oh, yeah.
because she and a neighbor wouldn't let him play Nintendo. And get this, his parents' reaction was, how we laughed. I mean, what a visual, right? This act of like childish rebellion met with amusement. What do you make of that?
Well, it makes you think, right? It's interesting how that parental reaction, even if it was meant to lighten the mood, could have sent a message. Like maybe Jeffrey learned that acting out in a disruptive way, even a gross way, could get attention. And that laughter, even though it seemed harmless, could have taught him that while being dramatic, even negative gets a reaction. And that's a pattern we see later on in his life, this need for a strong reaction, whether it's positive or negative.
Yeah, you're right. It's like he's figuring out how to get a rise out of people, even if it's not always in a positive way.
Yeah.
And then there's this shift he describes in adolescence. He kind of embraces the role of the special and bound for success kid while his sister starts to rebel. It's like they each take on these very defined and almost opposite identities within the family. Why do you think that happens?
Well, think about it like this. Maybe it was a way of creating a persona. By presenting himself as the good one, the successful one, he could maybe avoid some of those deeper anxieties or the hard work of actually accepting himself, flaws and all. It's a way of controlling the narrative, maybe masking insecurities. And that kind of curated image, even if it seems positive, can become a form of self-sabotage because it prevents genuine self-expression.
Yeah, it's like he's building a wall around himself, even if it's made of good intentions and achievements. And speaking of walls, he also talks about this musical bullying he did to his sister. He would constantly hum the witch's theme from The Wizard of Oz just to annoy her. It seems small, but it keeps coming up. What do you think about these little instances of like lighthearted disruption?
You know, Even in those small moments, you can see this potential discomfort with totally smooth, harmonious relationships. It's like there's a need to add a little friction, a little bit of conflict. And those small acts could be early signs of a tendency to maybe undermine positive connections or just create a bit of drama. And those seemingly insignificant threads, they can weave into bigger patterns later on where self-sabotage has, well, bigger consequences.
Yeah, it's like those little cracks in the foundation. They might seem small at first, but they can become bigger problems down the line. So we're starting to see these seeds of self-sabotaging behavior in his childhood. Let's move on to how these patterns show up as he starts to pursue his creative passions. He talks about this early partnership he had with an inflatable dummy named Gomez. They made these short films together until Gomez, well, literally deflated.
Oh, the punctured inflatable dummy. It's almost too perfect, right? Like a metaphor for fleeting creative inspiration or maybe even a fear of real connection. Because an inflatable dummy, it needs constant inflating. And once it's punctured, it's game over. There's no real substance there, no depth. It's like maybe it reflects a hesitancy to really invest in a creative partnership and a genuine collaboration.
Yeah, it's like he's drawn to these temporary fleeting things, even in his creative endeavors. And then there's his partnership with Cole and their party and play show. This sounds completely wild, like a fever dream sitcom. Bernadette Peters impersonations, a gun going off on stage. They even stole some of their own box office money. It's like creativity mixed with chaos.
This whole party and play era, it seems to shake this pattern where success is always tangled up with chaos or setbacks. The unconventional, almost deliberately disruptive nature of their shows, the story about stealing their own earnings, it suggests maybe a discomfort with just straight up uncomplicated achievement. Like maybe their internal success thermostat was set to slightly chaotic, never allowing them to fully embrace, well, just being successful.
Right, like they couldn't just be good. It always had to be messy and dramatic.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the infamous Gay Cruise performance. They completely bombed. Wrong audience, wrong material, lots of booing, even things being thrown at them. He describes it as a moment of utter failure, followed by a retreat into isolation.
That gay cruise experience, it's a really clear example of a setback that's amplified by a lack of self-awareness.
Hmm.
Their act, their intoxicated state, the audience's expectations, it was a recipe for disaster. And that retreat into isolation afterwards, while it's understandable to want to hide after something like that, it can also be self-sabotaging because it prevents growth. It prevents learning from that experience. It prevents re-engaging with the world and trying again.
Yeah, it's like he's punishing himself for the failure and in the process missing the opportunity to learn and grow from it. And then after that disaster, he somehow lands this logo development deal. So like a huge win, but then you find out it comes with zero budget and complete creative control. He actually calls it a nightmare that was the greatest thing that ever happened to me. How does that fit into this self-sabotage theme?
Well, think about it. Complete creative control might sound amazing, but without any support, financial or otherwise, it can set you up for failure, or at least for a lot of unnecessary struggle. It makes you wonder, was there an unconscious desire to make things harder than they needed to be? Was there a part of him that was actually drawn to these situations with built-in obstacles?
Right, like maybe he was more comfortable struggling than succeeding. And then, after he moves to Los Angeles, he makes a conscious decision to move away from the shared comedic style he had with Cole. He says he was afraid of competition and ended up doing these, like, basic hosting gigs that felt safer, but also less fulfilling.
This is a great example of self-sabotage driven by insecurity. He had this creative partnership that brought him success, but then fear took over. He chose what felt safe instead of what felt truly authentic. And in doing so, he might have avoided direct comparison, but he also stifled his own unique voice and potential.
Yeah, it's like he traded authenticity for a sense of security. And he even talks about constantly comparing himself to Cole's increasing success and then using that comparison as a reason to retreat further into those less challenging roles. It's a vicious cycle.
That comparison trap, it's a powerful form of self-sabotage, especially in creative fields where external validation can feel so important. But constantly focusing on what others are achieving, it can fuel feelings of inadequacy and lead to inaction. And that ultimately hinders your own progress. It erodes your self-belief.
Okay, let's switch gears and talk about relationships. His early romantic encounters are a whirlwind of intense but often short-lived connections, like his relationship with the giant and let's just say the three-way that involves some significant digestive distress. There's this pattern of rushing into intimacy and a lot of self-inflicted awkwardness. What's going on there?
Well, those early encounters, they're all about that rush towards physical intimacy. It's like he's seeking connection, but he's skipping over the slow, messy process of building real emotional intimacy. And that desperation can lead to overlooking red flags or creating situations that are, well, just not sustainable.
Hmm.
Or, as you said, really uncomfortable. It's like the intensity itself becomes the self-sabotage because it prevents the development of healthier, more stable relationships.
Yeah, it's like he's addicted to the drama, even if it ultimately leads to pain. And then there's his relationship with Paul, the sugar daddy. He describes a Christmas encounter that has this real sense of melancholy, this contrast between the transactional nature of their arrangement and his own feelings, especially during the holidays.
The relationship with Paul, it really highlights the emotional complexities of transactional relationships.
Mm.
You have the Christmas setting, which is supposed to be about warmth and connection, juxtaposed with this exchange of money for intimacy. It creates this sadness, this awareness of the gap between what he needs financially and what he longs for emotionally.
Right. Like he's trying to fill an emotional void with a financial transaction, and it just doesn't work. And his relationship with Patrick sounds even more turbulent. There's this performative online persona they both maintain versus the resentment and jealousy simmering beneath the surface. And he's actually aware enough to document these self-sabotaging steps on social media. It's like he's watching himself do it in real time.
It's interesting how social media can play into these patterns. The desire for validation, the carefully curated image that doesn't match the reality of the relationship, the conscious documentation of self-sabotaging behavior. It's like he's seeking attention while simultaneously undermining the relationship, almost as if he's expecting it to fail anyway.
Yeah, it's like he's writing the script for his own heartbreak. And then it all ends with a dramatic breakup with Patrick and a restraining order. But after all that chaos, he realizes that being alone is exactly what he needed. That's a pretty big turning point, isn't it?
Absolutely. That whole experience with Patrick, the emotional roller coaster, the restraining order, it forces him to confront his own patterns, and that realization that he actually needed solitude, it's a huge step towards self-awareness. He's starting to understand that maybe some of his choices were driven by a fear of being alone, which ironically led him to even more pain and ultimately forced him into that very aloneness.
Right, like he was running from something that he actually needed. Okay, let's look at his career aspirations. We see this pattern of him getting close to something he wants and then finding a way to derail it.
Yeah.
Like sending that fan letter to Joe Mantello, getting the opportunity to work as a director's assistant, and then impulsively quitting and running away from home. That sounds like peak self-sabotage.
That's a classic example of self-sabotage fueled by fear or maybe a lack of self-belief. He gets so close to this amazing opportunity and then he bails. It makes you wonder if he was afraid of success or if he felt like he didn't deserve it.
Yeah, it's like he's almost allergic to success. And then there's this story about him handing out flyers for The Drowsy Chaperone on Broadway. But instead of actually promoting the show, he's writing his own play in the lobby toilet.
That anecdote perfectly captures this struggle between focusing on the present and chasing future dreams. He's not fully engaged with the opportunity in front of him. He's always looking ahead, which ultimately undermines his performance in the present.
Yeah, it's like he can't fully commit to anything because he's always chasing something else. But then there's the encounter with Gary Beach. Initially, he's suspicious, thinking there must be some ulterior motive. But it turns out Gary is a genuine connection and a valuable mentor. It's like he almost sabotaged a positive experience with his own overthinking.
The initial suspicion towards Gary Beach shows how deeply ingrained those negative expectations can be. He's almost expecting to be disappointed, so he looks for reasons to distrust positive attention. But then he lets his guard down, and it leads to a really meaningful connection. It's a reminder that sometimes our own biases can prevent us from receiving good things.
Yeah, it's like he's so used to expecting the worst that he almost misses out on something good. And then there's this story about a community theater production of A Midsummer Night's Dream, where he completely loses it. He wants to destroy Brad because of some laughing during rehearsal. It's such an over-the-top reaction.
That outburst reveals how deeply his insecurities run and how difficult it is for him to handle even perceived slights. The intensity of his anger, the desire to destroy someone over something so minor, it points to a pattern of reacting disproportionately to things, which can damage relationships and opportunities.
Yeah, it's like he's creating drama where there doesn't need to be any. And even in his social interactions, this tendency towards self-sabotage shows up. He describes feeling really uncomfortable at gay gatherings, even underwear parties, like environments where he should theoretically feel a sense of belonging.
It shows how powerful those internal voices of self-criticism can be, even in seemingly accepting environments. He's surrounded by people who, in theory, should understand and accept him, but he's still trapped in this internal monologue of self-loathing.
Right, like he can't even enjoy himself because
Yeah.
he's so busy judging himself. And then there are his early experiences in AOL chat rooms, specifically with Kennedy, this intense emotional connection that blossoms online, followed by heartbreak and a descent into cynicism. It sets up a pattern of idealizing connections and then getting hurt.
That experience with Kennedy is a classic example of how online relationships can be both incredibly intense and ultimately disappointing. You build this connection based on, well, maybe idealized perceptions, and then reality crashes in. and it can lead to a cynicism that makes it harder to open up and trust in future relationships.
Yeah, it's like he's protecting himself from getting hurt again, but in doing so, he's also closing himself off to genuine connection. And the brief but intense relationship he has on Adam for Adam, ending in a tearful breakup on New Year's Eve, it also highlights this tendency to create a play-acted relationship that's doomed to fail.
The Adam for Adam relationship shows the danger of forcing a connection or creating a fantasy that's not based in reality. It's all about instant gratification, not real emotional investment. And eventually, that artificiality catches up with you.
Right, like he's following a script that he knows will lead to heartbreak. And even with Joel, during the Sydney Mardi Gras and Melbourne Comedy Festival, where there seems to be genuine affection and potential, he still holds back. There's jealousy and inability to fully commit.
The dynamic with Joel shows how past insecurities and self-sabotaging patterns can affect even the most promising new connections. He feels something real, but he's still hesitant, still afraid to fully let go and commit. It's like there's this internal conflict that prevents him from fully embracing a potentially great relationship.
It's like he's his own worst enemy, even when it comes to love. But thankfully, it's not all doom and gloom. He does experience moments of self-awareness and positive change, like filming that pilot presentation with Cole after years of distance and feeling that genuine connection rekindled. That sounds like a breakthrough.
That reunion with Cole, it represents a break in the pattern of avoidance. He's reconnecting with someone who knows him well, and they're able to create something together again. It suggests the possibility of healing old wounds and finding fulfilling relationships, both personal and creative.
Yeah, it's like he's finally letting go of the past and allowing himself to be vulnerable again.
Yeah.
And his decision to move back to New York, this time with a conscious effort to avoid running away from things, focusing on closure and intentionality, that's a huge step forward.
Yeah, that's a really significant shift. He's not running anymore. He's facing things head on. He's actively choosing to deal with the messy stuff, to create closure, to be intentional about his life. And that's a huge step away from those reactive, self-sabotaging behaviors.
Right, so like he's finally taking control of his own narrative. He ends the book acknowledging that the struggle with self-doubt is ongoing, but there's a sense of hope that writing the book represents a fresh start. He even says that the mountain of shame doesn't seem so daunting after acknowledging it. That's a pretty powerful takeaway.
That's a really important point. Acknowledging the patterns of self-sabotage, facing that shame, it's the first step towards real change. Writing the book itself becomes a form of self-confrontation, a way to break free from those old patterns.
Yeah, it's like he's shining a light on those dark corners of himself and realizing they're not as scary as he thought. And it makes me think of that quote from Elaine Stritch at the beginning of the book about those sacks of rocks we carry around. It's not about getting rid of them overnight. It's about recognizing them, acknowledging their weight, and maybe, just maybe, starting to put some of them down.
Exactly. It's an ongoing process, a journey of self-discovery. It's about learning to be kinder to ourselves, to understand our own patterns, and to make choices that lead to growth and fulfillment, even if it's messy and uncomfortable sometimes.
Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive into Jeffery Self's self-sabotage. It's definitely given me a lot to think about. What about you? What were some of the moments that stood out to you?
There were so many, it's hard to choose. But I think that overall theme of how those early experiences can shape our patterns and how those patterns can play out in our relationships, our creative pursuits, our careers, it's so relatable. And I think it's important to remember that self-awareness is not a destination, it's a journey.
We'd love to hear your thoughts, too. What resonated with you from our discussion? Did any of Jeffrey's experiences remind you of your own life? Share your insights with us in the comments or on social media. Let's keep this conversation going.
And we encourage you to take some time to reflect on your own experiences. What are your sacks of rocks? What patterns do you recognize in your own life?
And if you're interested in exploring Jeffery Self's story further, don't forget to check out the link to his book in the description. It's a really insightful and funny read.
It's a book that really makes you think and laugh and hopefully see yourself in a new light.
So as we wrap up today, here's a final question for you to ponder. Is self-sabotage always a purely negative force? Or could it sometimes be a misguided attempt at self-preservation, even if it's ultimately holding us back? What do you think? Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.